Welcome to Trust Talk. In today's episode, we meet Fabian Zuleeg, the CEO of the European Policy Center, a Brussels-based think tank. Fabian takes us behind the scenes of this influential organization, revealing how they help shape decisions and build trust across Europe and beyond. We dive into the EU's journey of fostering trust among member states and the challenges brought by rising Euroscepticism. Fabian introduces some intriguing concepts like cognitive dissonance in policymaking and the permapoly crisis, the never-ending wave of overlapping crises Europe faces. We tackle the rise of far-right movements and the tough job of restoring faith in democracy. Fabian shares how think tanks like the EPC are fighting to keep facts front and center in today's noisy info landscape. Plus, we'll touch on the future of the EU, with new members knocking on the door and the importance of keeping promises. Finally, we'll look ahead to the EPC's future challenges, from adapting to new technologies to attracting top-notch analysts. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Fabian, as a member of the management team at the European Policy Center in Brussels, can you briefly explain what your organization does and its main objectives and reflect on why trust is crucial for EPC's success?
What we do at the European Policy Center is we work very much as a think tank. What does that mean? It means we advise decision makers, we make recommendations, and we influence policy decisions. We do that at the European level, but also at the national level. And increasingly, we're also active internationally. We do many events, many publications, but also a lot of our work is networking. It's being active behind the scenes. And in all that activity, trust is very important in many different dimensions. There is the trust of the decision makers in our analysis, in our recommendations. Do they think these are valuable? Do they trust us as people? Because very often it is not simply a question of something written on paper. It is about who is actually proposing it. What are the connections you have? Much of the influencing takes place behind the scenes. It's trust in confidentiality. When we are having discussions with decision makers, they have to know that they're able to discuss things with us openly, that we're not going to use whatever they say to us against them. It's a trust in our ethics.
The EU was born out of a desire to overcome distrust by cementing cooperation through common laws, institutions and economic interdependence. This process undeniably fostered trust among member states over time. In your view, has this trust continued to deepen, or is that too optimistic considering the current state of intra-EU relations?
The EU has created something rather unique. It has created a way of former enemies working together and learning that they can trust each other, that there is a common endeavor which unites them. But we've also had, over the last years, a lot of challenges to that. And those challenges have also led to a decrease in trust at the European level. Member states don't work together in the same way as they used to. In part, that's because we have also more diversity, including governments which come from Eurosceptic backgrounds, who don't believe in the common endeavor in the same way. And we have seen that we are now facing a variety of wicked challenges which are very difficult to deal with, especially because they also involve winners and losers.
Fabian, you highlight Europe's struggle with what you call cognitive dissonance in addressing its numerous crises. Do you think this is essentially saying that policymakers are at a loss for solutions, or is there more nuance to this concept?
To use cognitive dissonance really to summarize a number of different phenomena. I think one part of it is that you hear not only from policymakers, but also from many populations, really the wish that the era which we're living in was different, that we wouldn't be facing the challenges which we are facing now. And that often leads to us acting in a way which assumes the world is different than it really is. And that's a dangerous cognitive dissonance because it does lead us down the wrong path, because the consequences of not addressing these challenges are rather severe. But what we also see is that many policymakers, when you talk to them behind closed doors, will tell you that actually they do have solutions, or they very much agree with the solutions you're putting forward. They agree with the analysis of what the world looks like. But the next step is always that they conclude that politically this cannot be done. So there is also a disconnect between the political realities we have and the policy solutions which are on the table, again leading to a situation where we're not addressing these fundamental challenges.
You also mentioned the term permapoly crisis to describe the ongoing state of multiple overlapping crises. How does this persistent condition impact Europe's ability to build and sustain trust among its member states and with its citizens?
Being in crisis, I think, does not necessarily mean that you have less trust or more trust with each other. It depends very much on whether you perceive the crisis as being something you are facing together, or whether you think this is something which actually tears you apart. If we see some of the crises we've had in the past as part of this permapoly crisis, in some parts of this crisis, we have very much acted together. For example, during the COVID epidemic, where we did things together at the European level, which would have seen as being impossible beforehand. But that's because leaders very much recognized that this was something we all had to face together. Similarly, at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we saw a lot of actions at the European level which were unthinkable beforehand, including, for example, taking on the millions of refugees from Ukraine, or dealing with the support needs for Ukraine's civil society, but also military. But we've also seen tendencies in the other direction. We've seen tendencies to very much work against each other, to not trust each other, for example, in the international field, when we're dealing with the United States or with China, where it is far more difficult to get a common approach. So we've seen both at the European level. And unfortunately, the permapoly crisis also means that we're going to have many more instances in future when we get tested again.
No doubt. I heard you also mentioning the term collective progress illusion, suggesting that Europe's actions aren't enough to meet its major challenges. What specific steps do you think Europe needs to take to overcome this illusion and build genuine trust among its citizens?
We have to start with what we call the brutal truth. We have to be more honest with citizens about the real challenges we are facing, and that to overcome them will be difficult, and it will be costly, and it will also involve sacrifices. To give one example, I think we've made a mistake when we have tried to explain to citizens about climate action which needs to be taken, that for a long time the rhetoric was very much that it is a good thing for Europe, that it will increase competitiveness, that it will help all of us also in the short term. And that simply isn't true. There will have to be costs which are borne, and we've seen a number of groups, a number of citizens protesting against elements of that. And I think in part that is because they feel that either they were not told the truth, or they feel that if they believe what has been said to them, then someone else should be responsible for dealing with these issues. So we have to be honest. We have to start also being more strategic. We have to plan. We have to tell people these are the big goals we have to achieve. And this is what we are going to have to do to get there. And that should also involve citizens themselves. It is not something which should just be imposed on people from an elite. It should be a real discussion about what is it we need to do together so that we address these challenges. And I think in all of that, for me, the real trust we have to build with citizens is that we are able to address these challenges not for us, but for our next generations. Because for us, life is probably going to be relatively safe, secure, relatively prosperous. But if we're not starting to take these actions now, if we're not overcoming the progress illusion now, then the ability of next generations to defend their values, their interests, will be severely impaired.
With the recent outcome of the European elections, particularly the rise of far-right and populist movements, trust in democratic institutions is being seriously tested. How can European leaders rebuild trust among citizens and prove that democracy can effectively handle these challenging times?
Difficult. The parties you mention, I don't use the label populist or far-right. I think what is a more apt label is anti-parties. They are parties which are against things. They are not parties which are putting very many solutions on the table. And that is very tempting for citizens because it looks like these parties really care about the issues which they feel are affecting their lives on a daily basis. But the reality is that we are facing very complex problems, very difficult problems, very costly problems. And we now have to prove that democracy can work in bad times, not only in good times. That will require the honest discussion, which I've already mentioned. But I also think that our political leaders are missing a trick. Because when we go back to the COVID crisis and we look at who were the leaders during COVID, who were trusted the most, it was not the leaders who were telling lies. It was not the leaders who said we can deal with this easily. It will not cost everyone. It was those who were the most honest. It were those who did say that this is something we have to handle together. It were also those leaders who admitted mistakes, who said we don't have all the answers, but we need to work together and we need to find our common goals together. And I think that is something we have to recognize is important. Leaders have to take responsibility, and only if they take responsibility will they be seen fit to lead.
In all that, we see a growing trend where facts seem to matter less and less in public discourse. What do you believe is the role of your think tank, like the European Policy Centre, in this environment? How does EPC plan to navigate and counteract this challenge to ensure that informed, fact-based policy making prevails?
It's a straightforward answer. Of course, as a think tank, part of the work we're doing is to produce facts, but also to explain facts, to make sure that decision makers have facts available to them to make decisions. But in today's environment, that's not enough, not least because we now have a very competitive marketplace for information, and that information is not necessarily facts, but nevertheless, you are competing. You are also competing in a very different environment than we have had 10, 20 years ago. People are consuming facts, consuming policy in a very different way than they used to. Social media is extremely important. People are consuming the facts or the information which is most relevant to their own little group. So we have many different little echo chambers. And I think think tanks have a big role to play in addressing this, but it will not be done by just simply doing what we've always done. We have to engage in debates also in different ways. We have to make sure that we can also package what we are saying in a way which people can find access to, can find also appealing, now facts also have to entertain. It's not enough to just simply have long rows of numbers or whatever it might be. That isn't convincing anymore. And in the end, what we also have to do is to prove that the kind of things which we are suggesting work and that we have solutions to the problems which we are facing and that we can help to navigate out of this difficult period in the interest of Europe's next generations.
What about the extension of the EU with new members knocking on the door of the EU? Will that in any way impact trust?
Something which is actually already impacting trust, but also trust within the EU is impacting the ability of the European Union to accept new members. So we have an issue that we know that the more member states we have, the more difficult it is to come to conclusions, to find a common line, to make things work. So we can't just accept new members without carrying out reforms internally. But at the other side of the argument, we now have countries where it's a geopolitical imperative that we accept them as new members. So we are making promises about when they can come in, when they can apply, what is going to happen. And we have to find a way of making those promises credible. And the big warning sign here is what we have done with the Western Balkans, where we have had now countries stuck in an accession process for decades, which is leading to, in many of these countries, the trust in the European Union and the trust in European integration steadily declining, because they are saying, rightly so, you promised us that we would be part of the family, but it's not happening. So we have to find a way of making real on our promises, but at the same time, making sure that this process is done in a way that then works. Because the last thing we want is an accession process where we have new members, but then it leads to a situation where the European Union doesn't function anymore. So we have to do all of that at the same time.
I always conclude my interview with a question about the future. So also for you, what are in your view the challenges of the organization that you lead in, let's say, the next 5 to 7 years?
Think tank means we have to continuously re-examine what we do and how we do it, because in the end, it is all about what impact do we have on policy. If we do not have any impact, then there is no reason to have a think tank. What does that mean? It means we have to change and adapt to all the different policy developments which are happening, including all the crises which we are facing, of which there will be more, which in the end will also mean that the work of a think tank will continue to be required. But it also means adapting to changing labor markets. One of the big challenges for any think tank at the moment is attracting high-level analysts who can really deal with this kind of level of challenge. It means also adapting to new technologies. Artificial intelligence is going to change the way think tanks work. It is going to change the political debate. So this is one example of where we will also have to learn how we deal with these new technologies, new issues, in a way which then still maintains our ability to make forward-looking recommendations for Europe.
Fabian, thank you very much for being available for the Trust Talk podcast. I wish you all the best with your organization and a lot of wisdom.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Trust Talk. We hope that you found the conversation valuable and informative. At Trust Talk, we believe in the power of trust to create positive change in the world. If you believe in our mission, we would greatly appreciate your support. You can help keep Trust Talk going by making a donation on our website at trusttalk.co/donate. Every contribution, no matter how small, helps us to continue bringing you thoughtful and engaging podcasts. Thank you for your support and for listening to Trust Talk. We look forward to meeting you again for future episodes.